The sound of heavy machinery echoed through the quiet suburb at dawn. Karen Morrison stood at her window, coffee mug trembling in her hands, watching her neighbor Marcus dig what could only be described as a medieval moat around his property. The drawbridge mechanism gleamed in the morning sun, masterpiece of spite and engineering. She'd pushed him too far this time. What started as a simple parking dispute had become neighborhood warfare, and Karen was about to discover that some battles have consequences that last forever. Marcus Chen had always been a reasonable man. In his 42 years, he'd negotiated million-dollar construction contracts, mediated disputes between hot-headed subcontractors, and somehow managed to keep his sanity while building half the shopping centers in suburban Denver. But standing in his driveway at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, staring at Karen Morrison's silver BMW deliberately parked across his exit, Marcus felt his legendary patience finally crack. The car sat there like a metallic middle finger, its bumper mere inches from his garage door, its rear end blocking the sidewalk. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't poor parking. This was warfare. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his breath visible in the crisp October air. He knocked on Karen's front door, the sound echoing through the pristine cul-de-sac where every lawn was manicured and every house painted in approved HOA colors. "Your car is blocking my driveway." The door opened to reveal Karen Morrison in all her glory, perfectly styled blonde hair, yoga pants that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and an expression that could freeze hell itself. "Oh, Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm so sorry, but I'm having my driveway resealed today. The workers need somewhere to park." Marcus gestured toward her empty 3-car driveway. "Your driveway looks fine too." "Me? Well, preventive maintenance is so important, don't you think?" Karen's smile never wavered. "I'm sure you understand. Being in construction and all, I have a job site to get to. I need you to move your car, now." Karen's perfectly contoured eyebrows arched. "I don't appreciate your tone, Marcus. We're neighbors, we should support each other." "Support?" Marcus felt his jaw clench. "Like when you reported me to the HOA for my work truck being too commercial for the neighborhood. That old thing was an eyesore. Like when you called the city about my fence being 6 inches too high. Property values. Marcus, surely you understand. Or like when you told the mailman I was suspicious because I work odd hours." Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I simply believe in maintaining standards. Perhaps if you made more of an effort to fit in, move your car." "I'm afraid I can't do that." "As I said, the workers." "What workers, Karen?" Marcus's voice rose. "There are no workers, there's no equipment. There's just your car blocking my driveway, because you get some sick pleasure out of making my life difficult." A few neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the raised voices. Mrs. Patterson from next door peered through her curtains. The Johnsons across the street stood on their porch, coffee cups in hand, watching the drama unfold. Karen noticed the audience and immediately shifted into victim mode. "I don't know why you're being so aggressive, Marcus. I'm simply trying to maintain my property. If you have such a problem with give me your keys." "Excuse me, if you won't move it, I'll move it for you." Karen clutched her designer purse closer. "You will not touch my vehicle. That's a $60,000 car." Marcus pulled out his phone. "Fine, I'm calling the police." "Go ahead." Karen's smile returned. "Victorious. Officer Reynolds is my cousin's husband. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about your threatening behavior." The call went exactly as Karen predicted. Officer Reynolds arrived 20 minutes later, listened to both sides of the story, and somehow concluded that this was a civil matter that didn't warrant police intervention. He suggested they work it out like neighbors and drove away, leaving Marcus standing in his blocked driveway with his hands clenched into fists. "Funny how that worked out," Karen said sweetly before disappearing back into her house. Marcus stood there for a long moment, watching the BMW gleam in the morning sun. Around him, the neighborhood returned to its artificial calm. Sprinklers hissed across perfect lawns. Garage doors rumbled open as people left for work, and life continued, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something had shifted in Marcus Chun's world. For 3 years, he'd endured Karen's petty tyrannies. The noise complaints when he started work too early. The HOA violations for infractions so minor they bordered on absurd. The passive-aggressive comments about his ethnic cooking smells. The way she'd convinced half the neighborhood that his construction business somehow made him less worthy of living in their precious suburban paradise. He'd taken it all with gritted teeth and professional courtesy, telling himself that some battles weren't worth fighting. That being the better person meant turning the other cheek. That eventually, karma would sort things out. But karma, Marcus realized, sometimes needed an engineer. He walked back into his house, past the photos of completed projects that lined his hallway, shopping centers, office buildings, the occasional residential job that had won awards for innovative design. His hand trailed along the wall, fingers tracing the frames as his mind began to work. In his home office, Marcus spread out the original plot survey of his property. The documents were meticulous, every inch accounted for, every boundary clearly marked. He'd bought this house specifically because of the lot size, nearly an acre in a neighborhood where most properties were a quarter of that. The previous owner had been an eccentric old man who'd insisted on the extra space for his garden railway. Marcus had kept the railway wound around his backyard in elaborate loops, complete with tunnels, bridges, and a miniature Victorian station. Karen had complained about that too, of course. Called it childish and inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. But as Marcus studied the survey, he realized the railway had given him something more valuable than nostalgia. It had given him perspective on his property lines, and more importantly, it had given him ideas. He spent the next hour researching city ordinances, building codes, and water management regulations. By lunchtime, he had a plan. By dinner, he had permits. By the end of the week, he had contractors. The first truck arrived on Monday morning, at exactly 6 a.m., the earliest time allowed by city noise ordinances. Karen's BMW was back in his driveway, parked with the same deliberate precision as before. But this time, Marcus didn't knock on her door. He didn't ask her to move. He simply directed the excavation crew to begin work. The sound of the first shovel hitting earth was like a starting gun. Karen appeared at her window within minutes, still in her silk pajamas, her face a mask of disbelief. Marcus waved cheerfully from his position near the survey stakes he'd placed around his property line. The excavator's bucket bit deep into the soil, carving a precise line that ran exactly 18 inches inside his boundary markers. By noon, the trench was 3 feet deep and completely surrounded his house and garage. By evening, it was 6 feet deep and lined with clay. The neighborhood had gathered like spectators at a gladiator match, phones out, recording everything for social media posterity. Karen finally emerged from her house as the sun was setting, marching across the growing moat on a temporary bridge the workers had installed for access. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she screamed. Her composure finally shattered. Marcus looked up from the blueprints he was reviewing with his foreman. "Home improvement. You inspired me with your talk about property maintenance. This is insane. You can't just dig a moat around your house." "Actually, I can." Marcus pulled out a folder thick with permits and documentation. Decorative water feature with integrated drainage system. Completely legal. I had the city engineer sign off on it personally. Karen's face cycled through several shades of red. "The HOA will never approve this." "Already did." Marcus smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it felt genuine. Turns out the Architectural Review Committee was very impressed with the historical authenticity. Medieval water features are apparently quite trendy in upscale communities. But. Karen sputtered, looking around at the growing crowd of neighbors. "The property values, the noise, the disruption? Oh, the disruption is just temporary. Once we install the drawbridge mechanism, everything will be much quieter." Drawbridge. Marcus gestured toward the elaborate mechanical assembly being unloaded from a flatbed truck. "Hydraulic system remote controlled. I designed it myself. Should be fully operational by Friday." Karen's legs seemed to give out. She sat down hard on the temporary bridge, staring at the medieval fortress her neighbor's house was becoming. "This is about the parking, isn't it? This is about boundaries. Karen, something you never learned to respect. I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested. You'll what? Call your cousin's husband again." Marcus's voice carried across the water-filled moat, echoing off the clay walls. "Here's the thing about having connections, Karen. I have them too. And mine actually know what they're talking about." As if summoned by his words, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. City Councilman David Rodriguez. 3 weeks after the drawbridge became operational, Willowbrook Estates had transformed from a sleepy suburban enclave into the most famous neighborhood in Denver. Tour buses rolled down Maple Lane every hour. Food trucks lined the adjacent streets. A local news crew had set up what appeared to be a permanent station across from Marcus's house, broadcasting live updates about the Moat house to a fascinated public. Karen Morrison watched from her kitchen window as another group of tourists posed for selfies in front of Marcus's medieval fortress, their laughter carrying across the water-filled divide that had once been a normal suburban lot. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the spectacle that had consumed her life. The doorbell rang with the persistence of someone who wouldn't be ignored. Karen found herself face-to-face with Rebecca Martinez, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, flanked by 3 other board members she recognized but had never bothered to learn the names of. "We need to talk," Rebecca said, pushing past Karen into the foyer without invitation. The living room quickly filled with the barely contained anger of suburban bureaucrats who'd lost control of their domain. Rebecca took the wingback chair like a throne while the others arranged themselves on the sofa with the grim efficiency of a firing squad. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Rebecca's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years managing HOA disputes and neighborhood politics. "Property values in this community have dropped 12% in 3 weeks. Karen blinked. "My property values. Everyone's property values. Who wants to buy a house next to a tourist attraction?" The Martinez family put their house on the market last Tuesday. They've had exactly 0 showings, because every potential buyer sees the circus outside and runs. Board member Janet Phillips leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the light. The city council is considering rezoning our entire neighborhood as mixed-use commercial because of the foot traffic. Do you understand what that means? It means, added Treasurer Bob Winters, that the Pizza Palace wants to open a location in the Hendersons' old house. The Hendersons, who moved to Phoenix last week because they couldn't sleep through the tour bus announcements. Karen felt the walls of her perfectly appointed living room closing in. This isn't my fault. Marcus is the one who built that thing. Marcus Chen filed for and received every permit required by law. Rebecca's voice was arctic. He followed every HOA guideline to the letter. He even improved the storm drainage for the entire block. Meanwhile, you've filed 17 noise complaints in 3 weeks, all of which were dismissed because the noise is coming from public streets, not his property. But surely the HOA can what? Rebecca stood, her shadow falling across Karen like a judgment. Can we force a homeowner to remove a legal, permitted, professionally engineered water feature that's become a beloved local landmark? Can we overturn city council decisions about tourism and economic development? Can we somehow undo the fact that you've made us the laughingstock of suburban Denver? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. This wasn't how the script was supposed to run. The HOA was supposed to be her weapon, her way of enforcing conformity and punishing those who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. There has to be something. There is. Rebecca's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. You can resign from the Architectural Review Committee, effective immediately. You can stop filing frivolous complaints, and you can find a way to fix the mess you've created, or we'll find someone who can. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Karen watched through her window as Marcus emerged from his house, crossed his drawbridge with the casual confidence of a man who'd won a war, and waved cheerfully to a tour group that immediately broke into applause. He's enjoying this, she whispered. Of course he's enjoying this. Janet Phillips gathered her papers with the crisp efficiency of someone delivering a verdict. You spent 3 years making his life miserable. Now he's made you famous for all the wrong reasons. That's not revenge, Karen. That's justice. After the HOA board left, Karen found herself alone with the growing realization that her world was collapsing in ways she'd never anticipated. The phone had been ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, lawyers offering to file lawsuits, her sister calling from California to ask if she'd really gone insane and started a war with a neighbor. She'd stopped answering. The real blow came Tuesday morning when she opened her front door to find Detective Sarah Winters, Bob's daughter. As it happened, standing on her porch with an official expression and a folder thick with documents. Karen Morrison, I need to ask you some questions about several incidents involving harassment and property destruction in this neighborhood. Karen's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. I haven't destroyed anyone's property. No, but property has been destroyed, and the evidence suggests a pattern of escalating behavior that may have motivated someone to take things too far. Detective Winters opened her folder, revealing photographs that made Karen's stomach drop. Marcus's work truck, the one she'd complained about so many times, with its tires slashed and "Go back where you came from" spray painted across the side. The miniature railway in his backyard, with several sections of track torn up and the Victorian station smashed. His mailbox, bent and twisted beyond recognition. These incidents occurred over the past 6 months. Detective Winters continued, we have security footage from several neighbors' cameras showing a figure in dark clothing accessing Mr. Chen's property on multiple occasions. The timestamps correspond exactly with noise complaints you filed the following days. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. You think I did this? I think someone wanted to drive Mr. Chen out of the neighborhood and escalated to vandalism when other methods failed. Someone who documented every complaint, every violation, every interaction with obsessive detail. Detective Winters held up a thick file. Your HOA complaint history reads like a stalker's journal. Ms. Morrison, those were legitimate complaints. 17 noise violations for a man who works construction and leaves for job sites at 7 a.m. 12 property violations for things like having his garbage cans visible from the street for more than 4 hours. 8 complaints about suspicious activity that turned out to be him working in his own yard. This isn't community vigilance, Ms. Morrison. This is harassment. Karen sank into her doorway, the weight of 3 years of accumulated spite pressing down on her like a physical force. She'd told herself she was protecting property values, maintaining standards, preserving the neighborhood's character. But hearing it cataloged by a police detective, she finally saw it for what it really was. I never vandalized anything, she whispered. Maybe not, but you created an environment where someone felt justified in doing it. And that someone made Mr. Chun's life hell for months before he decided to build his moat. Detective Winters closed the folder. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay for the damage to his property, all of it, and you're going to stop the harassment, or I'll find evidence linking you directly to the vandalism. Because trust me, Ms. Morrison, I will find it. As the detective walked away, Karen noticed something that hadn't been there that morning, A small sign had appeared near Marcus's Drawbridge, professional and tasteful. Willowbrook, Moat Tours, Saturdays and Sundays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Proceeds benefit local stormwater management projects. The line of people waiting for the next tour stretched around the block. That evening, Karen sat in her darkened kitchen, watching the last tour group of the day cross Marcus's Drawbridge. Children squealed with delight as the hydraulic system demonstrated its medieval majesty. Parents took pictures. A local historian dressed in period costume explained the engineering principles behind authentic castle defenses. Marcus himself appeared on the Drawbridge, wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans, looking nothing like the monster Karen had convinced herself he was. He answered questions with the patient expertise of someone who genuinely loved his work. He posed for pictures with a grace that made Karen realize she'd never actually seen him smile before the Moat. For 3 years, she'd seen him as an intruder, a threat to the perfect suburban bubble she'd worked so hard to create and control. But watching him now, surrounded by admirers and tour groups and city officials, treating him like a minor celebrity, Karen finally understood the truth. Marcus Chen had never been the problem. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping in her empty kitchen. All those complaints, all those violations, all those petty tyrannies she'd justified as community service, they'd been about her fear of losing control, her need to feel superior, her desperate attempt to make herself important in a world that had largely forgotten she existed. And now that world was beating a path to her neighbor's door, celebrating the very man she'd tried to destroy. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Thought you should know your BMW has been parked on city property for the past 3 days. Parking enforcement will be by tomorrow morning. Might want to move it, a concerned neighbor. Karen looked out her window. Her BMW sat exactly where she'd left it, in the same spot The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who had to navigate through a crowd of influencers filming TikTok videos in front of Marcus's Moat. Karen signed for the papers with shaking hands while teenagers in the background debated whether the Drawbridge was absolutely iconic or totally extra. 60 days. That's all the time she had left in the house she'd spent 15 years making perfect. The mortgage company's letter was clinical in its brutality. Property values had indeed collapsed, just as the HOA board had warned. But it wasn't just the tourism though. The daily circus of food trucks, tour groups, and social media influencers hadn't helped. The real killer was the lawsuit. Marcus Chen versus Morrison, Karen E. The civil case had been filed 3 months ago, seeking damages for 3 years of systematic harassment, property destruction, and what his lawyer called intentional infliction of emotional distress. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage, documented complaints, witness testimony from neighbors who'd finally found the courage to speak up about Karen's reign of suburban terror. Karen's lawyer had tried to argue that she was simply being a diligent community member, protecting property values and neighborhood standards. The judge had been unimpressed, particularly when Marcus's attorney presented the railway station footage, crystal clear video of Karen smashing the miniature Victorian building with a garden shovel at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night. The judgment was for $127,000 in damages and legal fees. Karen's house, now worth significantly less than she owed on it thanks to the neighborhood's transformation into a tourist destination, couldn't cover the debt even if she sold it. She sat in her kitchen, surrounded by moving boxes and the detritus of a life unraveling, watching Marcus work in his garden. The Moat tours had evolved into something more sophisticated: guided historical presentations that attracted visitors from across the region. The city had even designated it an official cultural landmark, complete with historical society plaques and a small gift shop in Marcus's converted garage. The irony was exquisite. The man she'd tried to drive out had become the neighborhood's most famous resident, while she was being driven out by her own actions. The doorbell rang with the tentative politeness of someone bringing bad news. Karen opened it to find Mrs. Patterson from next door, holding a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone attending a funeral. "I brought you some tuna, noodle casserole," Mrs. Patterson said, not quite meeting Karen's eyes. "For your ... transition." Karen accepted the dish mechanically. "Thank you. I also wanted to say..." Mrs. Patterson paused, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Sorry for not speaking up sooner about what you were doing to Marcus. We all saw it, Karen. The complaints, the harassment, the way you talked about him at HOA meetings. We knew it was wrong, but we didn't want to get involved." Karen felt something crack inside her chest. "You could have said something." "Yes, we could have. And maybe if we had, none of this would have happened." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated guilt. "But we were cowards. We let you bully that poor man because it was easier than confronting you." The admission hung between them like a confession. Karen realized that her neighbors hadn't been silent allies in her campaign against Marcus. They'd been uncomfortable witnesses to her slow-motion destruction of another human being. "He's a good man," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Did you know he fixed my sprinkler system last summer? No charge. Just saw me struggling with it and came over to help." That's who you spent 3 years torturing. Karen, a man who fixes his neighbors' sprinklers for free. After Mrs. Patterson left, Karen found herself walking to her front window, the same window where she'd spent countless hours watching Marcus, cataloging his perceived violations, building her case against his right to exist in her perfect world. But now she saw something different. Marcus was on his knees in his garden, teaching a small group of children about medieval agricultural techniques. The kids hung on his every word as he explained how castle gardens provided food during sieges, their faces bright with the kind of wonder that only comes from learning something genuinely fascinating from someone who genuinely cares about sharing knowledge. One little girl, she couldn't have been more than 7, raised her hand with the earnest intensity of a scholar. Mr. Marcus, did the people in castles have neighbors? Like, did they fight with them? Marcus smiled, and Karen could see him considering the question with the same seriousness he'd give to an adult inquiry. Well, sometimes they did fight. But you know what? The smartest castle builders figured out that it was better to have good neighbors than to fight all the time. Because when you're surrounded by people who care about you, you don't need walls to protect yourself. The little girl nodded sagely. So the moat isn't for keeping people out. No, Marcus said, glancing briefly toward Karen's window. It's for showing people that sometimes, when someone hurts you over and over, you have to build something beautiful to protect your peace of mind. Karen stepped back from the window, Marcus's words hitting her like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years trying to drive him away, but he'd never built walls to keep people out. He'd built something that drew them in, something that celebrated engineering and history and the simple human joy of seeing something unexpected and wonderful. Her phone buzzed with yet another call from a real estate agent. She'd been getting them daily since the foreclosure notice became public record. Vultures circling a carcass, offering cash sales at rock-bottom prices. But this call was different. Ms. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh & Associates. I represent a client who is interested in purchasing your property. Karen sank into a kitchen chair. My client is prepared to offer full asking price, cash, with a 30-day close. Karen nearly dropped the phone. Full asking price. Have you seen the neighborhood lately? My client is well aware of the current ... situation. In fact, that's precisely why they're interested. Something in the woman's tone made Karen's stomach clench. Who's your client? I'm not at liberty to say, but they've asked me to arrange a meeting with you tomorrow at 2 p.m., if you're available. The meeting was at the Starbucks on Main Street, neutral territory away from the circus that Willowbrook Estates had become. Karen arrived early, nursing a latte and trying to imagine what kind of person would pay full price for a house in a neighborhood that had become a tourist attraction. She didn't have to wonder long. Marcus Chun walked through the door at exactly 2 p.m., followed by a woman in an expensive suit who could only be Jennifer Walsh. He looked around the coffee shop, with the calm confidence of someone who'd already won every battle that mattered, then approached Karen's table. Hello, Karen. Karen's mouth went dry. You're buying my house? I'm considering it. Marcus sat down across from her, his presence filling the small space between them. Ms. Walsh, would you mind giving us a few minutes? The lawyer retreated to a corner table, leaving Karen alone with the man she'd spent 3 years trying to destroy. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Marcus studied her face with the same analytical precision he brought to his engineering projects. Because I want you to understand something. This was never about revenge, wasn't it? No, it was about boundaries, about consequences, about what happens when someone decides that another person doesn't deserve basic human dignity. Marcus's voice was calm, but Karen could hear the steel underneath. You spent 3 years trying to make me disappear. You vandalized my property. You called me suspicious. You tried to convince an entire neighborhood that I was somehow less worthy of living here because of my work, my heritage, my unwillingness to bow to your petty tyrannies. Karen felt tears burning behind her eyes. I never meant, yes, you did. You meant every complaint, every violation, every cruel comment. You meant to hurt me, to drive me away, to make me feel small and unwelcome. In my own home? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. But here's what you never understood, Karen. I didn't build that moat to hurt you. I built it to save myself. I don't understand. You were killing something inside me. Every day, every petty cruelty, every reminder that no matter what I achieved or how hard I worked, someone like you would always see me as an intruder. I was starting to believe you. Marcus's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. The moat wasn't revenge. It was resurrection. Karen wiped her eyes with a napkin that felt like sandpaper. So why buy my house? Marcus smiled, and, for the first time in their entire relationship, it held no anger, no bitterness, no triumph. Just something that might have been pity. Because, Karen, you need to learn the same lesson I did. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to build something beautiful from the ruins of what someone else tried to destroy. He stood to leave, then paused. The house comes with a condition. You have 60 days to find a new place to live, during which I'll pay all your expenses. After that, I'm turning your property into a community garden. Free classes on sustainable agriculture, children's programs, neighborhood events, Everything you spent 3 years trying to prevent. Karen stared at him, understanding finally dawning. You're not just buying my house, you're erasing me. No? 6 months later, Karen Morrison knelt in the dirt of what had once been her perfectly manicured front lawn, her hands deep in rich soil that smelled of compost and possibility. The community garden that now occupied her former property had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Beds overflowing with vegetables, herb spirals that attracted butterflies, a children's section where tiny hands learned to plant seeds and watch miracles grow. She wore old jeans and a faded t-shirt, her manicured nails now permanently stained with earth. The woman who had once terrorized HOA meetings about property values was now teaching a group of teenagers how to build a trellis for climbing beans. Her voice, patient and encouraging in ways that would have shocked her former neighbors. Remember, the goal isn't perfection, she told them, watching as they struggled with the bamboo poles and garden twine. Plants don't care if your structure looks like something from a magazine, they just need support to reach toward the light. Across the garden, Marcus worked with a group of elementary school children, their excited chatter carrying on the warm afternoon breeze. The sight of him no longer filled Karen with the bitter resentment that had consumed 3 years of her life. Instead, she felt something she was still learning to name, something that might have been peace. The path from that devastating meeting at Starbucks to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. The 60 days Marcus had given her to find new housing had stretched into the longest 2 months of her life. She'd used the time not just to pack boxes and sort through the debris of her old existence, but to confront the uncomfortable truth of who she'd become. The small apartment she'd rented across town felt like exile at first, a cramped space with thin walls and neighbors who worked night shifts and played music at volumes that would have sent the old Karen into a fury of noise, complaints. But gradually, something unexpected had happened. She'd started talking to these neighbors instead of documenting their violations. Maria, the single mother next door, became a friend who taught her to make tamales. Jerome, the night shift security guard upstairs, shared stories of his community college engineering classes. For the first time in years, Karen experienced what it felt like to be part of a community rather than its self-appointed enforcer. The garden had been Marcus's idea, but the implementation had required something neither of them had expected. The city council loved the concept of turning suburban blight into green space, but they needed someone with intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's soil conditions, drainage patterns, and seasonal light exposure. They needed someone who had spent 3 years obsessively documenting every detail of the area. They needed Karen. The phone call had come on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after she'd moved into her apartment. Marcus's voice, formal and careful, asking if she would consider consulting on the garden project. I know this is awkward, he'd said, but you know this land better than anyone. You documented every tree, every slope, every shadow pattern in your complaints to the HOA. That information could be valuable. Karen had sat in her small kitchen, holding the phone and trying to process the surreal reality of her former victim, asking for her help. Why would you want me involved? Because, Marcus had said slowly, I think you might need this as much as the community does. He'd been right, though Karen couldn't have imagined it at the time. The first planning meeting had been excruciating, sitting in Marcus's living room with city officials and community organizers, all of them politely pretending they didn't. No, she was the villain of the neighborhood's most famous story, but Marcus had treated her input with genuine respect, incorporating her suggestions about drainage and sun exposure into the garden's design. Slowly, meeting by meeting, Karen had found herself becoming something she'd never been before, collaborative partner rather than a dominating force. Now, 6 months later, she looked up from the bean trellis to see Marcus approaching with a small girl in tow, the same child who had asked about castle neighbors all those months ago. Miss Karen, the girl announced with the confidence of someone who believed adults existed primarily to answer her questions. Mr. Marcus says, you used to live in a house right here. Where did it go? Karen glanced at Marcus, who watched the exchange with quiet interest. They'd developed an easy working relationship over the months, but moments like this still carried echoes of their complicated history. Well, Emma, Karen said, sitting back on her heels, so she was at the child's eye level. Sometimes when people make mistakes, big mistakes, that hurt other people, they have to give up things that were important to them. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher, like when I had to give my toy to my sister because I broke hers. Something like that, yes. But you know what? Sometimes when you give something up, it becomes something even better than it was before. Emma looked around at the thriving garden, her young mind working to connect the concepts. So your house became food. Karen laughed, the first genuine laugh she could remember in years. Yes, sweetie, my house became food and friendship, and a place where people can learn and grow together. That's pretty cool, Emma declared, then ran off to investigate a butterfly that had landed on the sunflowers. Marcus sat down on the garden bench that had been installed where Karen's front steps used to be. She's right, you know? It is pretty cool. Karen joined him on the bench, both of them looking out over the space that represented such different things to each of them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the raised beds, and the air buzzed with the contentment of bees working. The lavender border. I need to tell you something, Karen said, her voice carrying the weight of months of accumulated understanding about why I did what I did. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You don't owe me an explanation. Yes, I do. I owe you that at least. Karen picked at a loose thread on her garden gloves, choosing her words carefully. I was afraid of me, of what you represented. Success I couldn't control. Happiness I couldn't diminish. A life that didn't need my approval or permission to exist. Karen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I spent so many years making myself important by making other people smaller. When you moved in successful, kind, self-sufficient, I realized how empty my own life had become. Marcus nodded slowly. So you tried to tear me down instead of building yourself up. I tried to convince myself that you were the problem, that if I could just make you conform, or better yet, make you leave, then everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be. Karen turned to face him directly, but the way it was supposed to be was broken. Marcus, I was broken, and instead of fixing myself, I tried to break you too. They sat in silence for a while, watching the garden breathe around them. A family with young children had arrived for the evening watering shift, their laughter mixing with the sound of water on leaves. Across the space, Mrs. Patterson tended to the herb spiral with the dedication of someone who'd found a new purpose in her retirement. You know what the strangest part is? Marcus said finally. I don't think I ever really hated you. I was angry, frustrated, hurt, definitely hurt. But hate requires a kind of energy I couldn't spare. I was too busy trying to figure out how to survive what you were doing to me. Karen felt tears threatening again, not the bitter tears of self-pity she'd shed during the foreclosure, but something cleaner. I hated myself. I just projected it onto you because it was easier. And now, Karen considered the question seriously. The woman who had terrorized Marcus for 3 years felt like a stranger. Now someone she remembered but could barely understand. Now I'm learning who I might have been all along, if I hadn't been so afraid of being ordinary. A commotion near the children's garden drew their attention. Emma had discovered a family of earthworms in the compost bin and was delivering an impromptu lecture to a growing crowd of kids about soil ecology. Her audience listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that sent her into even more detailed explanations. She reminds me of someone, Marcus said with a small smile. Karen followed his gaze to where Emma was now demonstrating proper worm handling technique. She's going to rule the world someday, probably, but hopefully she'll do it by building things up instead of tearing them down. The words hung between them, not an accusation, but an acknowledgement of how different paths could lead to such different kinds of power. As the sun began to set, families started packing up their gardening tools and calling children away from their explorations. The garden settled into the peaceful quiet of evening, with only the sound of automatic sprinklers. Beginning their nighttime cycle, Karen and Marcus remained on the bench, two people who had traveled through the worst of human nature to arrive at something that might have been understanding. I have something for you, Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it to Karen with the care of someone presenting something precious. Inside the tissue paper was a miniature bridge, expertly crafted from wood and metal, with tiny working hinges that allowed it to raise and lower. It was a perfect scale model of the drawbridge that had become the symbol of their shared history. I made it in my workshop, Marcus said. Thought you